I grew up believing my life was ordinary in the best possible way. Our house followed predictable rhythms: morning light through thin curtains, my mother humming while cooking, my father leaving early and returning before dark. Nothing dramatic ever happened, and that steadiness felt like safety. We trusted routines because they asked nothing from us. Looking back, that calm now feels fragile, like glass untouched only because no one dared tap it. At the time, I thought quiet meant peace. I didn't yet understand that quiet can also be concealment, a careful arrangement of silence, protecting something unseen beneath everything. My father was the pillar holding that glass world upright. He was dependable, punctual, and emotionally reserved, the kind of man who believed providing was love enough. He rarely raised his voice, never drank, and paid bills weeks early. People respected him because he asked for nothing and revealed even less. As a child, I mistook distance for dignity. I never questioned where he went on quiet weekends or why certain topics ended conversations abruptly. Fathers weren't supposed to explain everything. They were meant to be solid. And solidity, I believed, meant nothing dangerous could ever hide inside there anywhere. My mother completed the picture with warmth and small traditions. She remembered birthdays, pressed flowers into old books, and kept the house smelling like soap and rice. If my father was structure, she was reassurance. Together, they created a world that felt protected from sharp edges. Yet sometimes I noticed the way she avoided certain questions, how her smile tightened when the past surfaced accidentally. She never lied, but she redirected. At dinner, stories skipped years without explanation. I learned early that some gaps were normal. Families had blank spaces. I accepted that without resistance or curiosity or fear then. Our days followed a script so familiar it stopped feeling written. School, work, meals, sleep, repeat. Weekends were for cleaning and visiting relatives who spoke in the same careful tones. Nothing felt urgent. Nothing felt broken. Even the land around our home reflected that quiet order, except for one place everyone avoided mentioning. Behind the trees sat an abandoned property, swallowed by weeds and time. On it stood an old well, covered and unused. No one forbade us from going there. They simply never spoke of it, which felt heavier than any warning I could have imagined back then. As a child, I sensed rules without knowing their reasons. I knew which paths not to wander and which questions to keep small. Adults think children don't notice silence, but silence has weight. It presses into moments and teaches obedience without explanation. The well became part of that unspoken education. We walked past it without curiosity, as if interest itself was dangerous. Sometimes I caught my father staring toward the trees, his face unreadable, his posture rigid. He never explained that look. He didn't need to. The absence of explanation taught me more than words ever did back then either. Despite those moments, I trusted him completely. Children are loyal before they are curious. My father fixed broken chairs, drove neighbors to appointments, and stood quietly at funerals. He was present in all the ways that mattered publicly. No one ever whispered about him. No rumors touched our door. When people spoke his name, it carried respect, not suspicion. I absorbed that judgment without question. If the world saw him as good, then good he must be. I never considered that goodness can be carefully curated, or that silence can function as a mask, hiding something far more dangerous inside. There were signs I dismissed because love makes excuses easily. The locked drawer he never opened. The sudden tension when certain names surfaced. The way my mother would change the subject, gently but firmly. These moments passed like clouds, noticeable but fleeting. I believed storms belonged to other families. Ours was steady, reliable, untouched by scandal. That belief became part of my identity. I defended it silently, even from myself. To question him felt like betrayal. So I learned to smooth doubts before they sharpened. Trust, I thought, was something you protect at all costs, even when it hurts later. Memory is dangerous because it rearranges itself when new truths appear. At the time, everything felt aligned. The quiet was comforting, the gaps harmless. The well was simply there, like an old scar on land that had healed. I didn't feel drawn to it. I felt indifferent. Indifference, I would later learn, is often taught. It is a skill passed down to keep peace intact. We weren't curious because curiosity disrupts order, and our family valued order above everything else. I believed that order was proof of safety, not its disguise or warning or signal of danger waiting nearby quietly. If someone had told me then that peace can be manufactured, I would have laughed. Our life felt earned, not staged. We worked, we cared, we endured. Nothing about it felt false. Yet truth does not require noise to exist. It can settle quietly, patient, waiting for the smallest disturbance. I didn't know that disturbance would come from something so ordinary, so unintentional. At that time, I still believed that our past was finished, sealed, and harmless. I didn't realize the past was watching us, resting beneath the ground, preserved and undisturbed until one simple moment changed everything forever then. The moment arrived quietly, as all dangerous things do. It didn't feel like fate or revelation. It felt practical, even boring. A small task, an innocent choice, something I would not have remembered if it hadn't altered my life. That is what makes it terrifying. Disaster rarely announces itself. It waits for permission. As I moved toward that forgotten place, I carried no fear, only routine. I believed I was stepping into nothing. I didn't know I was opening a door that had been carefully sealed, one that would force truth to rise and shatter everything we believed was solid. Even now, I can trace the beginning of everything back to that choice. Not a crime, not a confrontation, just movement toward what was ignored. The life we believed in did not vanish immediately. It cracked softly, almost politely. I still trusted my father. I still believed in our quiet world. But something had shifted, subtle and irreversible. Once you step near a buried truth, it senses you. It waits, and it prepares to surface. I did not know what lay below that well, only that silence was thinning, and something old was ready to breathe again at last slowly. The first time I walked toward the back property on purpose, I told myself it was nothing, just a shortcut, just a practical errand with no story attached. The clothesline had snapped again, and my mother wanted rope. "Check the old shed," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Your father kept things out there." Her voice sounded casual, but her eyes slid away from mine a heartbeat too fast, like she'd stepped around a crack in the floor. Past the garden, the air changed. Not dramatically, no thunder, no sudden darkness, just a shift that made my skin tighten. The scent of soap thinned into damp earth and old leaves. Even the afternoon sounds felt muted, as if the birds were holding their breath. My footsteps suddenly sounded like trespassing. The abandoned property had been part of my childhood background, filed under not important. Seeing it up close as an adult made it hard to believe I'd ever called it ordinary. The fence sagged, vines threaded through broken slats, and the small house beyond it looked more like shadow than shelter. And then there was the well. It sat just off the path, ringed with stone, capped with warped boards and a slack chain. Moss crawled over the rim. From far away, it could have been any old well. Up close, it felt like something that had been actively removed from the family narrative. Not simply unused, avoided, edited out. I stared at it longer than I meant to. The padlock hung crooked, old enough to be part of the stone. I told myself the lock was for safety, but the way the chain was looped, tight once, now loosened by time, felt less like protection and more like restraint. I forced my gaze away and focused on the shed. Rope. Go back. End of errand. The shed door complained when I pulled it open. Dust rose in the sunlight. The smell inside hit me, oil, mildew, and a sour metal note that tightened my throat. Tools hung from hooks where my father must have left them. A shovel, jars of nails, a cracked lantern. It didn't feel like storage. It felt like a room abandoned mid-thought. I rummaged through crates, fingers brushing brittle twine and torn tarp. No rope. I muttered, irritated, and that irritation made me bolder. I stepped deeper, dragged a box aside, and my shoes scraped something that clinked faintly on the floor. The sound startled me, too sharp in the muffled air, like the shed didn't want to be reminded it still existed. That was when I heard the first echo. Not a voice, not footsteps, just a hollow, airy exhale like wind traveling through stone. It didn't come from the shed at all. It came from outside, from the direction of the well, soft enough that I might have imagined it if my body hadn't reacted first. My shoulders rose. My hands went clammy. I stood still, listening. A second sound followed, steady, patient dripping. But it wasn't raining. The sky was clear. The drip kept time anyway, like someone counting seconds I hadn't agreed to count. "Rats," I whispered, because numbing something normal is how you keep fear from growing teeth. Still, my mind flashed to the well. That childish instinct, don't go near, don't look down, came back so suddenly it felt like someone else's memory had slid into mine. I yanked a folded tarp off a stack of boards, and there it was, rope, thick and coiled, dusty but strong. Relief hit me so fast it almost made me laugh. See, practical, nothing mysterious. I grabbed the coil and turned toward the door. Then the sound came again. Drip, echo, and this time a faint metallic tap, like something swinging against stone. Curiosity climbed over my relief and planted itself in my chest. I stepped out of the shed and looked toward the well. The air smelled sharper near it, damp moss, rust, and something faintly sweet, like paper left too long in a drawer. I walked closer without deciding to. Each step felt louder than it should have. The chain on the well moved slightly, just enough to make the padlock click against the stone rim. I crouched. The boards were loose. I could slide my fingers under the edge. My mother's averted eyes returned to me, and with them a warning I hadn't noticed at the time. I swallowed and told myself I was only checking the cover, only making sure it was secure. Responsibility, not curiosity. I lifted one board. Cold air rolled up from the opening, damp and stale, and it smelled like deep water that never sees light. The darkness beneath didn't look empty. It looked occupied. My eyes adjusted, and the stone walls dropped down in a narrow circle that swallowed the sunlight. I couldn't see the bottom. The dripping grew louder, closer, as if the well had been holding its breath and finally decided to speak. Somewhere below, something scraped against stone. My grip tightened on the board. I told myself it was a branch, a small animal, the board settling, but my body stopped believing my own excuses. My heart thudded in my throat, and suddenly the rope in my lap felt less like a tool and more like a tether. I should have lowered the board and walked away. Instead, I widened the gap, lifting a second board to let more light fall into the throat of the well. The chain clinked softly. The padlock swung and tapped the stone, metal on rock, exactly the sound I'd heard. Then came a small splash. Something surfaced. Not fast, not alive. It rose slowly, like an old thought pushing through sleep, turning gently in the water as if the well itself were presenting it. At first, my mind refused to name it. It was only a dark shape, swollen, the size of my hand. Then it rotated and caught the light. A pale rectangle flashed, paper, laminated, coated in something that had stubbornly resisted years of water. A photograph. My stomach dropped so hard it felt like falling. The photograph bobbed at the surface, trembling with each drip, as if it were trying to breathe. I didn't understand how it could still exist or why it was rising now. I only knew, sharp, certain, immediate, that this well wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was storage. It was a hiding place. The wind finally moved through the trees, a low whisper that made the board in my hand shiver. The padlock tapped again, a quiet warning bell. The photograph drifted closer to the stone wall, pulled by a current I couldn't see, and for a terrible moment it felt like it was coming to meet me. And in that instant, I realized the well wasn't abandoned at all. It had been waiting for me today. I reached toward the opening before I even realized I'd decided to. Because somewhere deep in my chest, where trust had always lived like a warm, steady thing, a new feeling formed, cold and sharp and awake. Even before I touched the photo, I understood the truth that made my mouth go dry. Whatever my father had buried here was not finished staying buried. I lifted the photograph from the well with shaking fingers, careful as if it might dissolve the moment I touched it. Water streamed from its edges, cold and brown, dripping back into the darkness below like the well was reluctantly giving something up. The surface felt thick, warped by time, but solid. Real. That alone made my chest tighten. Nothing that old should have survived down there. Nothing that important should have been thrown away so carelessly and sealed so deliberately. I didn't look at it right away. I couldn't. I pressed it flat against my palm as if delaying the truth would soften it. The air around me felt heavier, damp with more than moisture. I told myself it was probably trash, some stranger's memory, something meaningless. That lie lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. Then I turned it over. My father's face stared back at me. The recognition was instant and violent, like a physical blow. Not gradual, not questionable. My breath left my lungs in a sharp, humiliating sound. I knew that face in every season of my life, older now, yes, lined by years and restraint, but the structure was unmistakable. The eyes, the jaw, the faint scar near his temple that he said came from a childhood fall. I had traced that scar with my finger once when I was little. I would have known him anywhere. But everything else was wrong. He was young in the photograph, younger than I had ever seen him in person. His hair was thicker, darker, and his expression was not the one I recognized. This version of my father was smiling, openly, recklessly, with a softness that didn't belong to the man who raised me. He wore clothes I had never seen him wear, light-colored, informal, almost careless. Not the uniform of responsibility I associated with him, not the father I knew. And he wasn't alone. There were two other people in the photograph, standing close enough that their shoulders touched his. A woman on one side, her face partially turned away, hair loose around her shoulders. A man on the other, his arm draped casually behind my father's back. They looked relaxed, familiar with each other, like people caught mid-laughter before they noticed the camera, like people who shared something. The background confused me even more. It wasn't our town. I knew every corner of this place, the buildings, the hills, the dull sameness of it. This setting was different. Too open, too wild, trees I didn't recognize, stonework I had never seen. It felt like another country entirely or another life. My mind rejected the image before my heart could process it. This can't be him, I thought. It looks like him, but it is. People resemble each other all the time. Faces repeat themselves. Coincidences happen. I clung to those thoughts desperately, stacking them one on top of another like sandbags against a flood. I studied the photograph for flaws, for proof that my eyes were betraying me. The water damage had softened the edges, but the center remained clear, almost protected. The image had been printed on thick paper, laminated thinly, as if someone wanted it to last. The corners were rounded from handling, not from decay. This picture had been kept, touched, valued before it was hidden. I felt something inside me fracture quietly. I crouched there by the well, the rope forgotten, the shed forgotten, the world narrowed to the rectangle in my hands. The smell of damp stone mixed with something sharper now, old paper, rust, memory. I was aware of my own breathing, too loud, too fast, like I was afraid the photograph might hear me and vanish. My father had never mentioned this place, never mentioned these people, never mentioned a time when he looked like this, felt like this. I had grown up on carefully curated stories, work, responsibility, endurance. Hard years that taught discipline. Nothing about laughter. Nothing about friendships that left marks. Nothing about a life before us that required hiding. I told myself there must be an explanation. There always is if you want one badly enough. Maybe this was from before he met my mother. Maybe it was from a short trip he never thought mattered. Maybe the well was simply a convenient place to discard old things when the house filled up. People throw away photographs all the time. It didn't mean anything. It didn't have to. But my hands were trembling, and my chest ached in a way logic couldn't soothe. I turned the photograph over again, searching the back like it might rescue me. Sometimes people write names, dates, places. Sometimes there are clues meant to anchor memories. The back was mostly blank, stained with brown water and dirt, but near one corner, faint and uneven, was writing. 3 words, smudged but legible. I wiped gently with my sleeve, my pulse roaring in my ears. I don't regret this. The sentence hit harder than the image itself. It wasn't nostalgic. It wasn't affectionate. It was defiant, written by someone who believed they had made a choice worth defending, someone who expected that choice to be questioned one day. My knees weakened, and I sat back against the stone rim of the well, clutching the photograph to my chest like it might fall apart if I loosened my grip. The well seemed deeper now, darker, as if it were swallowing light on purpose. The drip echoed louder, slower, each sound stretching the moment further than it wanted to go. I replayed every memory I had of my father, searching for this version of him. The man in the photograph didn't match the man who corrected my posture at the table, who spoke sparingly, who believed emotions were indulgences you managed privately. This man looked free. capable of risk, capable of choices that weren't approved or safe or easily explained. And that terrified me. Because if this picture was real, and every instinct in me knew it was, then my understanding of my father wasn't incomplete. It was constructed, carefully assembled from what he chose to show and what everyone else agreed not to ask. The well wasn't just a hiding place for objects. It was a place where truths went to wait. I thought about my mother's careful redirections, her tightened smile, her refusal to linger on the past. I thought about the locked drawer, the long silences, the way my father looked toward these trees like he was listening for something that never quite arrived. All of it rearranged itself inside me, forming a picture far more unsettling than the one in my hands. This wasn't a forgotten photograph. It was evidence. Evidence that my father had lived a life he never confessed. Evidence that something had happened here, something powerful enough to be sealed underground, something he believed would stay buried if he was patient enough. Evidence that the quiet life we believed in had been built over something unfinished. My fear didn't come from the image alone. It came from what the image demanded. Questions I couldn't unask, truths I couldn't unknow. If my father had nothing to hide, this photograph would have been in a drawer, a box, a frame. It would have been explained away with a story. Instead, it had been chained, locked, and thrown into darkness. As I stared at his younger face, at that unfamiliar smile, one thought rose above all the others, cold and undeniable. Why was this hidden? And what else had he made sure I would never find? After I put the photograph away, nothing about my father looked the same. He sat at the table that evening, reading the paper like he always did, his glasses slipping down his nose, his coffee untouched. To anyone else, he was exactly the man he had always been. To me, he felt like a carefully maintained illusion. I watched the way his hands folded the pages, precise and controlled, and wondered how many versions of him I had never been allowed to see. Memory became treacherous once doubt entered it. Moments I had filed away as unimportant began to replay themselves, altered by suspicion. His strict rules, once framed as discipline, now felt selective. He never explained why some questions ended conversations, why certain topics earned silence instead of answers. I had learned early not to press him. Authority doesn't need justification when it's absolute. I had mistaken that for strength. I remembered the way he avoided photographs. Family pictures existed, but he never lingered over them. He stood where he was told, smiled briefly, then stepped away as if documentation itself made him uneasy. At the time, I assumed modesty. Now I wondered if images had power over him, if being seen, truly seen, had once cost him something he never recovered. There were flashes of anger too, rare but sharp. He never shouted without reason, but when he did, it felt disproportionate, like something old breaking through restraint. Once when I asked about the abandoned property as a child, his voice dropped so suddenly it startled me. "That place is not for you," he said, and the finality of it shut my mouth. I didn't ask again. I told myself it was protection. Parents protect by limiting access. That was normal, or so I believed. As I replayed that moment now, the memory burned differently. His reaction hadn't been fear for me. It had been fear of something else. Fear of proximity, fear of memory, fear of what curiosity might unearth if left unattended. I wondered how many times he had redirected my life away from edges I never noticed. Love complicates doubt because it resists conclusions. Every instinct in me rose to defend him. He had been there for me. He had worked without complaint. He had never hurt me. Those facts felt solid, undeniable. I clung to them like proof of innocence. People are not their secrets, I told myself. People are their actions. And his actions toward me had been careful, even kind. But kindness does not erase concealment. I thought about my mother, about the way she deferred to him in quiet ways. She never challenged his silences, never contradicted his refusals. Their marriage had been built on something unspoken, a mutual agreement not to disturb what lay beneath daily life. I wondered if she knew everything or only enough to survive beside him. The thought that she might have chosen not to know unsettled me almost as much as the possibility that she did. My father had always been a man of rules. Some made sense. Others felt arbitrary, enforced without explanation. Don't go there. Don't ask that. Don't touch what doesn't belong to you. I had internalized those boundaries so completely that I rarely questioned them. Obedience had felt like respect. Respect had felt like love. I was only now realizing how easily those concepts can blur. The photograph had cracked something inside me that refused to seal again. I couldn't unsee the younger version of him, relaxed and unguarded. That man contradicted the one who raised me. It wasn't just a matter of age or maturity. It was a difference of essence. One had chosen risk. The other had built walls, and walls are rarely constructed without something to defend against. I found myself watching him more closely, noticing the pauses in his speech, the way his eyes flicked away when the past brushed too near. He spoke carefully, choosing words that closed doors instead of opening them. I realized then that I had mistaken his restraint for honesty. In truth, restraint had been his method of control. He didn't lie often. He simply omitted. That realization hurt more than any outright betrayal could have. Lies can be confronted. Omissions are harder to challenge because they masquerade as nothing at all. How do you accuse someone of what they never said? How do you demand answers to questions you were trained not to form? I felt torn between two instincts that refused to reconcile. One urged me to protect him, to shield him from whatever consequences the past might still carry. The other demanded truth, not as punishment, but as necessity. I didn't want to destroy him. I wanted to understand him. Yet understanding threatened everything we had built. Silence began to feel like participation. By not asking, by not looking, by not pushing, I was preserving his version of reality at the expense of my own. The photograph had already proven that reality could be curated. If I accepted that without challenge, I would become part of the curation. I would inherit his silences, pass them on, and call it peace. That thought frightened me more than confrontation ever could. I realized then that love does not require blindness. Loyalty does not demand ignorance. If my father was human, then he was capable of failure. And if he was capable of failure, then he was not entitled to my unquestioning protection. Respecting him meant acknowledging his complexity, not erasing it. I didn't know yet what the truth would cost. I only knew that I could no longer pretend the questions didn't exist. The man I thought I knew had fractures I was only beginning to see, and those fractures pointed somewhere specific, somewhere buried and deliberately avoided. The well was not finished with me, and neither was the past. Once I accepted that silence was no longer neutral, I began asking questions quietly, the way you do when you already know the answers might hurt. I didn't start with accusations or names. I started with memories, with casual curiosity disguised as nostalgia. Do you remember the old property? I asked neighbors I'd known my whole life. What was it used for back then? I kept my voice light, my smile practiced. I learned quickly that tone mattered more than words. Most people answered too fast. Nothing important, they said, or that was before your time. Some laughed the way people laugh when they want to close a door politely. Others frowned and changed the subject entirely, pointing out whether errands, anything safer. The repetition of avoidance felt rehearsed. One person deflecting could be coincidence. A dozen felt like choreography. I visited Mrs. Harlan first because she had lived here longer than anyone. She was nearly 90, her memory praised openly by the town. If anyone could answer without fear, it would be her. I brought her bread, sat at her kitchen table, listened to stories that wandered comfortably through decades until I mentioned the well. Her hands froze mid-gesture. The bread knife hovered in the air. For a moment, she didn't look old at all. She looked alert, afraid. That place is best left alone, she said, too quickly. Her eyes darted to the door, then back to me. Some things don't need revisiting. Why? I asked gently. She shook her head, lips pressed tight. Because we survived by not asking, she said, and stood up, ending the visit without another word. That phrase followed me home. We survived by not asking. Survival implied danger. It implied cost. It implied something had happened that required cooperation, not curiosity. I tried a different approach. The town records office was small, underfunded, and rarely used. The clerk knew me by name, had watched me grow up. I requested old property maps, zoning files, anything related to the abandoned land. She hesitated, fingers resting on the drawer handle. That area was decommissioned years ago, she said. There's not much to see. But there must be something, I pressed. Old permits, ownership changes. She sighed and opened the drawer, sliding a thin folder across the counter. Too thin. Inside were incomplete pages, dates missing, signatures absent. Entire years skipped without explanation. It wasn't empty. It was curated. Someone had decided what would remain visible. As I flipped through the papers, I felt eyes on me. The clerk busied herself with nothing, humming softly. When I asked about the missing records, she didn't look up. Sometimes things get lost, she said. Sometimes it's better that way. That was when I first heard my father's name spoken differently. It happened outside the records office, where two men were talking near a truck. They lowered their voices when they saw me, but not fast enough. "His doing," one muttered. The other shook his head. "He kept it together," he said. "That's what matters." They noticed me watching and fell silent. One cleared his throat. "Good day," he said stiffly, like the conversation had never existed. But the words echoed. His doing, kept it together. Those weren't compliments. They were justifications. I began to realize the town didn't see my father as simply respectable. They saw him as necessary. The deeper I went, the more resistance I met. Elders warned me gently. Peers avoided me entirely. A woman I'd known since childhood grabbed my arm outside the market and whispered, "Be careful what you dig up. Some truths don't belong to just one family." Her grip was tight, urgent. "People made choices," she added, then released me like she'd said too much. Fear became the common language. Not panic, not hysteria, controlled fear. The kind that settles into routines and convinces itself its wisdom. The town had agreed, silently, that whatever had happened was over. That peace depended on collective forgetting, and my questions threatened that agreement. I noticed how my father's name changed the air. When I mentioned him casually, people stiffened or softened depending on who they were. Some defended him immediately, praising his reliability, his years of service. Others grew quiet, their faces shuttered. No one spoke neutrally. Neutrality would have been honesty. At night, I replayed every conversation, every hesitation, every coded phrase. Patterns emerged. The incident, whatever it was, had happened long ago. It involved the abandoned property. It required silence from multiple people. And my father had been central enough that his continued stability mattered to everyone. I wondered how many people had been carrying this weight quietly, convincing themselves it was gone simply because time had passed. Time doesn't erase responsibility. It only dulls the urgency. I was almost ready to stop. The pressure was subtle but relentless, doors closing softly, invitations not extended, conversations ending early. I felt watched, measured, like the town was deciding how dangerous my curiosity might become. Fear tugged at me, urging retreat. Maybe I didn't need to know everything. Maybe the past could stay buried. Then Mr. Calder knocked on my door. He was my father's age, a man who rarely left his house since his wife died. I hadn't spoken to him in years. He stood on my porch with his hat in his hands, eyes downcast. "I heard you've been asking questions," he said. I nodded, heart pounding. He hesitated, then looked up, his gaze steady but tired. "You deserve to know," he said. "But once you do, you won't be able to put it back." I stepped aside and let him in, understanding that this was the crack everything had been waiting for. Mr. Calder sat at my kitchen table like a man preparing for judgment. He didn't touch the tea I poured him. His hands rested flat on the wood, palms down, as if he needed the weight of something solid to keep him from drifting away. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Silence filled the room, thick and deliberate, the kind that had shaped this town for decades. "I'm not proud of what I know," he said finally, "and I'm less proud of what I didn't do." I waited. I had learned by then that pressing too hard only tightened the locks people carried inside them. "It started with money," he said, staring at the table instead of me. "It always does, even when people pretend it doesn't. Years ago, long before I was born, the abandoned property had not been abandoned at all. It belonged to a small group of men, my father among them. They had pooled resources, made plans, talked about opportunity the way young men do when they believe time will forgive everything. There were promises, handshakes, trust built on shared ambition. And then there was disagreement. Not over whether to proceed, but over who would benefit when they did. One of the men wanted out, not quietly. He wanted his share back, plus more, claiming deception. He threatened to expose details that could ruin everyone involved. Mr. Calder's voice tightened when he said this, his fingers curling slightly. He didn't understand what he was risking, he said. Or maybe he did and thought fear would protect him. The night it happened, they met near the well. It was secluded, off-record, the kind of place chosen specifically because no one went there anymore. Words escalated. Accusations followed. Someone pushed. Someone fell. Mr. Calder swallowed hard, his throat working as if forcing the memory upward hurt physically. They told themselves it was an accident, he said. That if they didn't mean it, they weren't responsible. The man didn't die immediately. That part lingered in the air between us, unspoken but heavy. He was injured, unable to climb out, his voice echoing up from the stone walls. Panic replaced reason. Fear made decisions quickly, brutally. Instead of helping him, they sealed the well. Boards, chain, lock. The town would call it abandonment. They would call it necessity. My father was the one who insisted on sealing it properly. He said loose ends destroy lives, Mr. Calder murmured. He said if they handled it cleanly, everyone could move on. The room felt smaller with every word. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car passing outside, life continuing without regard for what was unfolding inside me. My father's voice echoed in my mind, steady and controlled, explaining rules without reasons. Loose ends destroy lives. I had lived by that philosophy without knowing its origin. The photograph came last. The men had taken it earlier that day, before everything collapsed. A record of trust that no longer existed. When the man disappeared, the photograph became dangerous. Proof of association, proof of presence, proof that contradicted the story they agreed to tell. So my father threw it into the well, believing darkness would finish what time began. He thought burying it would bury the guilt, Mr. Calder said. He was wrong. I asked the question I had been avoiding since the moment I lifted that picture from the water. Did anyone try to stop him? Mr. Calder met my eyes then, and the shame there was unmistakable. We all did, he said, and none of us did enough. The town knew, not every detail, not every name, but enough. Enough to understand that peace depended on silence. The well was sealed not just with wood and metal, but with agreement. The past was declared closed. Children were raised away from it. Curiosity was gently discouraged. Survival became the justification for forgetting. My father didn't speak of it again. He built a life defined by restraint, responsibility, and control. He became respectable because respectability was armor. The town accepted it because it needed him too. A man burdened by guilt can be relied upon to keep order. As Mr. Calder spoke, my emotions collided violently. Anger rose first, sharp and unforgiving. Then disbelief, then grief for a man I realized I had never fully known. I wanted to scream, to deny it, to tear the story apart and prove it false. But every detail aligned too cleanly with the fragments I had already uncovered. The silences, the fear, the well. This isn't just his secret, I whispered. It's all of yours. Mr. Calder nodded slowly. That's why it's taken so long to surface. When he left, the house felt hollow, stripped of illusion. I sat alone with the weight of knowledge pressing down on me, heavier than any fear I had felt before. Knowing did not bring relief. It brought responsibility. Ignorance had allowed me to love my father without question. Truth demanded something more difficult. I understood then why the well had been sealed so carefully. It wasn't just about hiding a crime. It was about protecting a version of life that could continue without collapse. My father had chosen control over confession, order over honesty, and the town had agreed. The photograph in my drawer felt heavier now, no longer just evidence, but inheritance. A burden passed down, demanding acknowledgement. The truth did not free me. It bound me tighter than ignorance ever had. I realized then that learning the truth was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a far more difficult one. I waited 3 days before I spoke to my father, not because I needed time to prepare what I would say, but because I needed time to accept that there was no version of this conversation that would leave us unchanged. During those days, he moved through the house as he always had, quiet, deliberate, careful not to disturb anything. Watching him felt unbearable, like standing beside a stranger wearing my father's face. When I finally asked him to sit with me, he didn't resist. That frightened me more than denial would have. He folded his hands on the table, the same table where he had corrected my posture as a child, where he had taught me that honesty mattered. His eyes stayed on mine, steady and guarded, as if he already knew which door I was about to open. "I found something," I said. He didn't ask what. I placed the photograph between us. The wood absorbed the sound softly, as if the table itself understood the gravity of what rested on it. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then his gaze dropped, and something shifted in his face, not shock, not confusion, but recognition. Resignation. "You went there," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. My throat tightened. "You knew I would." He exhaled slowly, like a man releasing a breath he had been holding for decades. "I hoped you wouldn't." Silence stretched between us, heavy and charged. I waited for denial, for anger, for some attempt to reclaim control. None came. Instead, he reached out and touched the edge of the photograph, his fingers trembling slightly. That tremor broke something inside me. This was not the unshakable man I had grown up with. This was someone tired. "You could have told me," I said, "at any point." His jaw tightened. "And destroyed everything?" he asked. The word stung. Everything. He meant the family, the life, the version of himself that had survived. I realized then that he had never believed the truth belonged to me. He had believed it belonged to consequences. "I did what I thought was necessary," he said. "People were afraid, mistakes were made, there was no clean way out." "Mistakes," my voice cracked despite my effort to control it. "Someone disappeared." He flinched just barely. "Someone fell," he corrected, then stopped. His eyes closed briefly. When he opened them again, they were wet. And I didn't save him. The admission settled between us like a wound finally exposed to air. He didn't offer excuses the way I expected. He didn't beg forgiveness. He spoke instead of pressure, of fear, of the belief that chaos would consume everything if order wasn't preserved. He said the word survival more than once, as if repeating it might justify the cost. "I thought burying it would end it," he said. "I thought time would do the rest." I looked at him and saw a man who had lived half his life guarding a lie so carefully it had shaped every choice he made. His distance, his rules, his silences, they were not signs of strength. They were defenses. I felt a surge of compassion that terrified me. Compassion makes betrayal harder to confront. "You taught me that doing the right thing matters," I said, "even when it's hard." He nodded slowly. "I taught you what I couldn't live up to." That honesty hurt more than denial would have. It humanized him in a way I wasn't ready for. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had chosen control over confession and paid for it in silence. But understanding him did not erase what he had done. "I love you," I said, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them. He looked at me then, really looked, and something like relief crossed his face. "I know. But loving you doesn't mean protecting this," I continued. "It doesn't mean pretending it never happened." He nodded again, slower this time. "That's the part I was afraid of." We sat there, bound by blood and truth, neither of us victorious. I saw clearly then that love does not absolve. It complicates. It demands honesty where silence once felt safer. My father had lived believing that shielding me from his worst choice was an act of love. I was realizing that shielding the truth only passed the burden forward. When I stood to leave the table, he didn't stop me. He didn't ask what I would do next. In his silence, I heard acceptance and something like relief. The secret was no longer his alone. As I walked away, I understood the weight of the choice before me. The truth could remain buried, preserving what little peace remained. Or it could surface, destroying the careful order built on silence. Either way, innocence was already gone. The question, was no longer what my father had done. It was what I would do with the truth he had left me. After confronting my father, the house no longer felt like shelter. Every wall carried echoes. Every room held a version of us that no longer existed. I moved through familiar spaces with unfamiliar weight, aware that knowing the truth had shifted something permanent inside me. Silence was no longer neutral. It pressed against my chest like a demand. I hadn't told anyone else yet, but the truth felt loud, as if it were already announcing itself through the cracks in our lives. My mother noticed first. She always did. She asked nothing directly, only watched me with careful attention, the way someone studies a wound they're afraid to touch. When I finally told her, her face did not show surprise. It showed recognition. She sat very still as I spoke, hands folded, eyes lowered, absorbing words she had likely anticipated for years. When I finished, she closed her eyes and whispered, "I prayed this would stay buried." Her reaction hurt more than anger would have. She didn't defend him. She didn't condemn him either. She spoke of endurance, of the choices women make when survival demands compromise. "We built a life," she said. "We protected you." I wanted to scream that protection built on lies is not protection at all. Instead, I listened as she pleaded for silence, not for his sake alone, but for hers. Truth would unravel more than one life. Others responded differently. My brother demanded accountability the moment he learned. He spoke in absolutes, his anger sharp and righteous. "If it's true," he said, "then it has to come out." He didn't carry the same memories, the same emotional tether. For him, the choice was clean, justice over comfort, truth over loyalty. I envied his clarity even as it frightened me. Family gatherings turned tense, conversations brittle. Words were chosen carefully, like everyone was navigating a room full of exposed wires. Some relatives avoided me entirely, unwilling to risk association with the truth. Others whispered support, but asked me to move slowly, cautiously. "Think of the consequences," they said, as if consequences hadn't already arrived. At night, I lay awake, weighing futures against each other. In one, the truth stayed buried. My parents aged quietly. The town remained intact. Our family gatherings continued, polite and restrained. In the other, everything fractured. My father faced judgment. My mother carried public shame. I became the one who broke the silence everyone had agreed to keep. Neither future offered peace. Both demanded sacrifice. I tried to imagine myself choosing silence, carrying the knowledge quietly until it dulled with time. But the photograph burned in my mind, the words on its back echoing. I don't regret this. That defiance demanded response. If I stayed quiet, I wouldn't just be protecting my father. I would be validating his choice. I would become complicit in the lie that order mattered more than truth. Integrity is a lonely thing. It asks for loss without promising reward. I realized that no matter what I chose, someone I loved would suffer. The question was whose suffering I could live with. My father's, exposed to consequences long delayed. My mother's, forced into a reckoning she had avoided. Or my own, shouldering the guilt of silence forever. The decision hovered, unresolved, until the choice was no longer mine to make. One afternoon, police cars appeared near the abandoned property. Word spread quickly, carried on the same breathless curiosity that had once been discouraged. Someone had reported an irregularity. Boards shifted, chain disturbed, evidence surfaced. I stood at the edge of the gathering crowd, heart pounding, understanding with sick clarity that the past had chosen its moment. As officers cordoned off the area, my father found me. His face was pale, resigned. He didn't ask what I had done. He didn't need to. "It's time," he said quietly. In his voice, I heard relief beneath the fear. In that moment, I understood that truth, once uncovered, does not ask permission. It rises when it must, breaking families, towns, and illusions alike. I had delayed the decision, believing I held control. I never did. The choice that would break our family had already been made long ago. The day the truth surfaced, it did not explode. It seeped. Police tape fluttered around the abandoned property like a warning the land itself had been trying to give us for years. Officers moved carefully, deliberately, as if they already understood they were stepping into something older than procedure. The well stood at the center of it all, uncovered now, exposed to daylight for the first time in decades. People gathered at a distance, pretending curiosity while carrying fear in their eyes. The town that had survived by not asking was being forced to watch. News traveled faster than facts. By evening, my father's name was everywhere, spoken softly, argued loudly, defended angrily. The man who had been dependable, respectable, invisible in his authority was suddenly visible in the worst way. Exposure stripped him of the armor he had worn so carefully. People who once praised his restraint now questioned his silence. Others clung to the version of him they needed to believe in. Truth fractures communities because it forces people to choose which memories they trust. I watched his reputation collapse without spectacle. No shouting crowds, no dramatic arrests, just doors closing. Conversations stopping mid-sentence when he entered a room. Averted eyes. That was how judgment arrived here, quietly, efficiently. The same way silence had once protected him now turned against him. The town fractured along invisible fault lines that had always been there. Some demanded accountability, anger sharpened by years of buried guilt. Others rallied around him, insisting the past should stay past. He kept things stable, they said. He did what had to be done. Survival was still their favorite defense. It was easier to justify a crime than to confront the cost of ignoring it. I became a convenient target. Some blamed me openly, accusing me of destroying a family, a town, a peace that had lasted decades. Why now? They asked. Why dig it up? Their words carried fear disguised as outrage. If I was the problem, then their silence could remain innocent. I learned how quickly moral responsibility gets redirected when truth threatens comfort. Isolation settled in. Friends I had known all my life stopped calling. Familiar faces turned cold. I felt the weight of being the one who broke the agreement everyone else had honored. Even those who believed me often kept their distance, afraid of being pulled into the fallout. Truth is contagious. People avoid it the way they avoid illness. But not everyone turned away. Unexpected voices reached out quietly. A woman whose brother had disappeared years ago left flowers on my doorstep without a note. An elderly man stopped me outside the store and said, "Thank you," before walking away, tears in his eyes. Their support didn't erase the hostility, but it anchored me. It reminded me that truth doesn't just destroy. It reveals who has been waiting for it. My father withdrew as the days passed. He spoke little, his posture shrinking under the weight of collective scrutiny. He didn't ask for forgiveness publicly. He didn't defend himself. Watching him suffer did not bring satisfaction. It brought grief. I mourned the father I had known, even as I accepted that he had never been whole. Accountability humanizes wrongdoing by forcing it into the open, where it can no longer hide behind intention. The investigation uncovered more than one secret. Other names surfaced. Other compromises were revealed. People who had convinced themselves they were bystanders realized they had been participants all along. Guilt spread unevenly, resisted fiercely. Some confessed willingly. Others denied until denial collapsed under evidence. The town's shared lie unraveled thread by thread. Media attention followed, shallow and relentless. Strangers consumed our story as entertainment, reducing decades of silence into headlines and speculation. I learned how easily pain becomes spectacle once it leaves private space. But even that exposure had purpose. It prevented the truth from being quietly reburied. Through it all, I held the photograph like a talisman. The image that had risen from the well had done exactly what it promised. It refused to stay hidden. It forced recognition, not just of what happened, but of who we had been while it remained buried. I thought often about the well during those days, how it had waited, how it had preserved what it was given. The town had believed time would dissolve responsibility. Instead, time had only prepared the truth for resurfacing. Water does not erase, it keeps. When the first hearings were announced, something inside me finally stilled. Not relief, not victory, acceptance. The lie had reached its end. Whatever remained would have to be built on what survived exposure. I understood then that truth does not restore what it destroys. It only clears space. What grows afterward depends on what people are willing to face. As the town struggled with its reflection, I faced my own. I was no longer just a daughter. I was a witness. And witnesses do not get to choose comfort. As the noise began to fade, as the arguments exhausted themselves, one question remained, quiet and persistent. What remains when lies fall apart? In the weeks after everything settled into its new, broken shape, I found myself returning to the well in my thoughts more than in person. It had become something larger than stone and water. It was a lesson I hadn't asked for, one that rewrote my understanding of family, loyalty, and courage. I no longer feared it. I respected it. The well had not created the truth. It had only kept it safe until someone was ready to listen. I grieved my father in layers. First for the man he had been to me, then for the man he might have been if fear had not shaped his choices. I mourned the quiet evenings, the predictable rhythms, the safety I once believed was unbreakable. That innocence did not survive the truth. It couldn't. But I came to understand that innocence built on silence is not peace. It is suspension, waiting for impact. My father and I spoke little after the truth emerged. There were no dramatic reconciliations, no final speeches that tied everything neatly together. We shared small moments instead, glances, pauses, the understanding that love can exist alongside irreparable damage. He carried his consequences with a quiet dignity that surprised me. Not absolution, but acceptance. Watching him face what he had buried taught me that accountability is not humiliation. It is acknowledgement. I learned that integrity is rarely loud. It does not announce itself or demand applause. It works slowly, often alone, reshaping lives from the inside out. Choosing truth cost me relationships, comfort, and the illusion of safety. But it gave me something sturdier in return. Clarity. The ability to stand in my own life without flinching. The town changed too, not all at once. Not completely. Some people clung to old narratives, others rebuilt carefully. The fractures did not disappear, but they became visible, which mattered. When cracks are seen, they can be reinforced. When they are ignored, they spread silently. The well had been a crack everyone pretended not to notice. I stopped blaming myself for the damage. The truth did not break us. The lie did. All I did was remove the cover. That realization freed me from the weight of false guilt. Responsibility belongs to actions, not to those who expose them. I carried that lesson forward, letting it guide choices large and small. Sometimes I still dream of the photograph, rising slowly through dark water. In the dream, I do not reach for it. I let it surface on its own. It always does. That is what truth wants. It does not need force. It needs time and courage. The well taught me that silence is not neutral. It protects what is buried, not what is right. Silence preserves comfort for those who benefit from forgetting. Truth, even when painful, protects the future by preventing repetition. We cannot heal what we refuse to name. I no longer believe in perfect parents or perfect stories. I believe in human beings making choices, sometimes terrible ones, and living with what follows. I believe love is strongest when it refuses to lie. I believe facing reality is an act of courage, not betrayal. When I pass the abandoned property now, the well is sealed again, but not hidden. There is a marker beside it, simple and honest. No names, no excuses, just acknowledgement. That feels right. Some things do not need elaboration. They need remembrance. I carry forward a quieter life now, one built on awareness instead of illusion. I ask questions. I listen when answers make me uncomfortable. I understand that strength is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear decide what stays hidden. The well did not ruin my family. It revealed us. It showed me that truth, once surfaced, does not ask to be put back. It asks to be carried forward, carefully, responsibly, and without shame. Silence protects the past. Truth protects the future.